Jesus of Nazareth. There is a man who never wrote a single word. No books, no letters, no records in his own hand. Everything we know about him was written by other people years after he died. And yet, roughly a third of every human being alive on this planet today organizes their entire moral life around what they believe he said. Think about that for a second. He lived in a tiny, dusty corner of the Roman Empire, a place so insignificant that most Roman historians barely mentioned it. He was born into poverty, raised by a carpenter, and spent most of his life in obscurity. He never led an army. He never held political office. He never accumulated wealth. By every measure the ancient world used to judge a man's importance, he had none. And then, somewhere around the age of 30, he started talking. What came out of his mouth was so disruptive, so quietly radical, that the most powerful empire in the world decided he needed to die for it. Not because he was violent, not because he raised a rebellion, but because the ideas themselves were dangerous. Love your enemies. The meek will inherit the earth. The last will be first. These were not the values of Rome. These were not the values of any empire that had ever existed. Rome crucified him publicly, the way you crucify someone when you want to make a point. When you want people to watch and understand what happens to those who disturb the order of things. It didn't work. Within 3 centuries, the empire that killed him had adopted his name as its official religion. The cross, the instrument of his execution, became the most recognized symbol in human history. His birthday restructured the entire Western calendar. His teachings formed the moral backbone of hospitals, universities, legal systems, and charitable organizations across 2,000 years. But here is the part that stays with you. We don't actually know with certainty what he looked like. We don't know the exact sound of his voice, the precise words he used in his native Aramaic, or even the exact year he was born. The image most people carry in their heads, the pale, long-haired, blue-eyed figure, was painted by European artists over 1,000 years after his death. They painted someone who looked like them. Every culture that absorbed his story reshaped him slightly in their own image, and maybe that is the secret of his influence. He became a mirror, a figure vast and open enough that the poor saw a liberator, the powerful saw a divine mandate, the suffering saw comfort, and the revolutionary saw permission. He has been used to justify wars and to end them, to oppress and to free, to build cathedrals and to burn people alive. One man, no written words, dead before the age of 40, and the world has never stopped arguing about what he meant. Muhammad. He was a 40-year-old merchant sitting alone in a cave when everything changed, not just for him, for the world. He had gone to that cave, as he often did, to think, to escape the noise of the city below, the idol worship, the inequality, the cruelty he saw every day in the streets of Mecca. He was a man known for his honesty in a society that rewarded deception, a man troubled by things most people around him had simply accepted. And then, in the darkness of that cave, he later said an angel came to him and spoke one word. Read. It is a strange first word for a divine revelation, especially since Muhammad, by most accounts, could not read. But that command, Iqra, became the seed of something that would eventually reshape the map of the entire world. What followed was 23 years of revelation, a complete system. Not just spiritual guidance, but law, economics, social structure, rules of war, rules of marriage, rules of inheritance. A total architecture for human civilization delivered, he said, from God directly through him. The world he was born into was tribal and fractured. Arabia was a place where infant girls were buried alive, where the strong owned the weak without question, where there was no unified law and no unified identity. Within his own lifetime, Muhammad united those warring tribes into a single community under a single God. He did it through preaching, yes, but also through war, through diplomacy, through strategic marriage alliances, and through a quality his followers describe again and again in the early texts, an almost magnetic personal authority. People who met him tended to follow him. When he died in 632 AD, the faith he had built controlled the Arabian Peninsula. Within 100 years of his death, a single century, his followers had built one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. From Spain to Central Asia, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Persia. Islam moved faster across the earth than almost any idea in recorded history, and it carried things with it: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. While Europe was fumbling through its dark ages, the Islamic world was translating Greek texts, building libraries, running hospitals, and developing the algebra that your phone uses to function right now. The numeral system you used to read the year you were born, the so-called Arabic numerals, came through the civilization Muhammad's revelation created. Today, nearly 2 billion people on Earth identify as Muslim. They pray 5 times a day facing the same direction. They fast the same month every year. They make, if they can, the same pilgrimage to the same city where a 40-year-old man once sat alone in a cave and heard something that would not let him stay silent. The cave is still there. People still go to it. And the argument about what he heard, whether it was divine, whether it was human, whether it was both, is one that a quarter of the human race considers the most important question in existence. Gautama Buddha. He had everything: a palace, a kingdom waiting for him, a beautiful wife, a newborn son, servants who made sure he never once encountered anything unpleasant. His father, a king, had been told by a prophecy at his birth, "This child will either become the greatest ruler the world has ever seen, or he will renounce it all and become a holy man." His father chose the first option on his behalf. He built walls around the boy's entire life, kept suffering out, kept death out, kept sickness out. It worked, for a while. But one day, the young prince slipped past the walls, and in a single afternoon, he saw 4 things he had never been allowed to see: an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering monk who, despite having nothing, looked at peace. He was 29 years old. He walked back into his palace, looked at his sleeping wife and infant son, and left. In the middle of the night, without waking them, he walked away from everything his father had built to protect him. He spent the next 6 years destroying himself looking for answers. He sat with the most extreme ascetics of his time, men who starved themselves, who held painful postures for days, who believed that punishing the body was the path to freeing the mind. He became so thin, the ancient texts say, that you could feel his spine through his stomach. He pushed himself to the edge of death, convinced that suffering had to be the answer. It wasn't. One evening, a young girl offered him a bowl of rice. He ate it. The ascetics around him were disgusted. They left him, and he sat down beneath a fig tree and made a decision. He would sit there until he understood. He sat for 49 days. What he arrived at was so simple it almost sounds like nothing. Suffering exists. Suffering has a cause. The cause is craving this endless, restless hunger for things to be different than they are. And there is a way out. That's it, that's the core of it. No God required, no divine authority, no commandments handed down from above. Just a man sitting under a tree, watching his own mind, and discovering something about the nature of human experience that he then spent the next 45 years walking from village to village, trying to explain to anyone who would listen. He died at 80, under another tree, surrounded by his followers. His last words, by most accounts, were something close to "all things that arise must pass away, work out your salvation with diligence." He left no empire. He never touched political power. He wrote nothing himself. And yet 500 million people today follow his path. His influence quietly saturates modern psychology, neuroscience, and the way millions of people in the Western world think about their own minds. Mindfulness, that word you see on wellness apps and therapy worksheets, is a direct descendant of what he developed sitting under that tree. The boy whose father tried to protect him from suffering spent his entire life walking toward it, and in doing so, showed a significant fraction of humanity how to stop running from it. Julius Caesar. He stood at the edge of a river and made a decision that was illegal, not just against the rules, actually illegal. The law of Rome was explicit. No general could cross the Rubicon River with his army intact. That river was a boundary. On one side, you were a military commander. On the other side, you were an invader, a traitor, a man the entire Roman state could legally kill on sight. He crossed it anyway. And in that single step, Julius Caesar ended the Roman Republic and set in motion a chain of events that would shape the next 2,000 years of Western civilization. But here is what makes Caesar different from other conquerors. He wasn't just a soldier. He was something rarer and more dangerous. He was a soldier who understood people. He grew up watching Rome tear itself apart. The rich getting richer, the poor getting nothing. The Senate a room full of aristocrats making every decision for everyone while pretending it was democracy. Caesar saw the gap between what Rome said it was and what it actually was. And he was talented enough, charming enough, and ruthless enough to use that gap as a ladder. He was a genius at war, yes. His campaigns in Gaul, modern-day France, were so brutally efficient that historians estimate he killed or enslaved over 1 million people in a decade. He wrote about it himself, in clean, precise Latin, in dispatches designed to make Rome fall in love with him from a distance. He understood that war was also theatre. But his real power was personal. The soldiers who served under him were fanatically loyal, not because they feared him, but because he made them feel seen. He remembered names, he shared their conditions, he pushed himself as hard as he pushed them. There is a story, possibly embellished, probably true in spirit, that when his army once refused to march, he addressed them not as soldiers, but as citizens, and shamed them back into formation with a single speech. They wept, they begged to follow him. That is a specific kind of power, the kind that doesn't come from a title. The Senate saw what was coming. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, 23 men surrounded him in a theatre and stabbed him to death. They thought killing him would save the Republic. It destroyed it faster. His assassination triggered a civil war that ended with his adopted son Augustus becoming the first true emperor of Rome. The Republic never recovered. The system Caesar had broken was buried with the men who killed him. But his name survived everything. For the next 2 millennia, the title Caesar became the word for supreme ruler across dozens of languages and cultures. The German Kaiser, the Russian Tsar, Both are just pronunciations of the same name, a man dead for 2,000 years, and his name was still being used as a synonym for absolute power well into the 20th century. He crossed a river, and the world built itself around the ripple. Alexander the Great. He was 20 years old when he became king, and he spent exactly 0 days enjoying the peace of it. His father, Philip of Macedon, had spent decades building the most disciplined army the Greek world had ever seen. He had unified Greece through a combination of warfare and politics that bordered on genius. And then an assassin's blade ended him at a wedding celebration, and the throne fell to his son, a boy, a student of Aristotle, a young man who had grown up sleeping with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow and a dagger beside it. The neighboring kingdoms immediately assumed the empire would collapse. Within 2 years, Alexander had crushed every rebellion, secured every border, and turned his father's army towards the greatest military campaign in ancient history. He was going east, all the way east. He was going to conquer Persia, the largest empire the world had ever seen, an empire that had humiliated Greece twice in living memory. He never came back. Not because he failed. Because he couldn't stop. He defeated the Persian Emperor Darius 3 times. He took Egypt without a battle, and they made him a god. He pushed through modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. He crossed the Hindu Kush mountains in winter. He reached the edge of India, and his generals, men who had followed him for over a decade, men who had crossed deserts and mountains and rivers of blood, finally told him they would go no further. It is said he wept. Not from sadness, from the feeling that there were no more worlds left to conquer. He turned back. He never made it home. At 32 years old in Babylon, Alexander the Great died. The cause is still debated. Fever, poison, excessive drinking, a body simply worn down to nothing by a decade of relentless campaigning. He had ruled an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India. He had never lost a single battle, and when his generals gathered around his deathbed and asked who should inherit his empire, he allegedly said, "The strongest." They tore it apart within a generation. But what he left behind was not land. Land can be reclaimed. What Alexander spread was something far harder to contain. Everywhere his army marched, Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek architecture, and Greek ideas took root. The ancient world calls this the Hellenistic period, this flowering of Greek culture across the entire known world. It was the soil in which early Christianity grew. It was the framework through which Rome absorbed and transmitted Greek thought to the Western world. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of human knowledge in the ancient world, was built in a city he founded and named after himself, one of over 20 cities named Alexandria. He was a man who remade the map of the world before most people today have finished their education. A boy who went to sleep reading about heroes and woke up becoming one, and was dead before he turned 33. Genghis Khan. He was born clutching a blood clot in his fist. The shamans who attended his birth took this as a sign. In the tradition of the Mongolian steppe, it meant he was destined to be a great warrior. His mother named him Temujin, which means iron or blacksmith. A hard name for a hard world. Because the steppe was not a place that produced soft people. It was a place of brutal winters, constant tribal warfare, and survival measured in livestock and violence. His father was poisoned by a rival clan before Temujin was 10 years old. After that, his own clan abandoned him, left him and his mother and his siblings alone on the steppe to die. They ate roots and rats and whatever they could find. He watched his mother keep them alive through sheer ferocity, and something hardened in him during those years that never softened again. He was briefly enslaved. He escaped. And then, slowly, patiently, with a terrifying combination of military brilliance and political cunning, he began to unite the fractured tribes of Mongolia. Not just through conquest, through a system. He abolished the old tribal aristocracy. He promoted men based on loyalty and ability, not bloodline. He gave his soldiers a share of the plunder. He created a meritocracy in the middle of a world built entirely on inherited power. By 1206, every tribe on the Mongolian steppe had united under a single banner. They gave him a new name, Genghis Khan, universal ruler. What followed is almost impossible to comprehend in its scale. The Mongol army he built was unlike anything the medieval world had encountered. They moved faster than anyone thought an army could move. They communicated across vast distances using a relay system of horse riders that made their coordination seem almost supernatural to their enemies. They were masters of psychological warfare. Cities that surrendered were spared. Cities that resisted were annihilated so completely that sometimes the ruins were salted and the rivers were rerouted over them, so that no one would ever know a city had stood there at all. Historians estimate that the Mongol conquests killed somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. In a world with a fraction of today's population, that represented nearly 10% of every human being alive. Entire civilizations were erased. The Islamic Golden Age, that flowering of mathematics and science and philosophy, was effectively ended when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258 and threw the contents of its great library into the river Tigris. Witnesses said the water ran black with ink for days. And yet, the empire he built also created something historians call the Pax Mongolica, a peace, a connected highway of trade and communication stretching from China to Europe. The Silk Road functioned under Mongol protection. Ideas, goods, and diseases, including the Black Death, traveled it freely. He died in 1227, his empire still expanding. Geneticists today estimate that roughly 16 million men alive on Earth carry his Y chromosome. 1 in every 200 men on the planet is his direct biological descendant. He came from nothing, from a dead father and an abandoned childhood and a world that had already decided he would not survive. And he left a mark on the human species that is literally written into our DNA. Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the shortest significant person in the room, almost nowhere he went. That detail matters, because one of the most persistent stories about Napoleon Bonaparte, that he was a tiny, aggressive little man compensating for his height, is largely a myth. He was around 5'6" or 7" in modern measurements, average for his time. The rumor was partly British propaganda, partly a confusion over French and English units of measurement, and partly the instinct powerful people have always triggered in those who fear them. Shrink them down, make them laughable, make their ambition seem like a symptom rather than a force of nature. Because Napoleon's ambition was not a symptom of anything. It was the most disciplined, focused, intellectually rigorous ambition the modern world had ever produced. He was born on Corsica, an island that had been sold to France by Genoa the year before his birth, which meant that technically, for 1 year, he wasn't even French. He grew up speaking Corsican and Italian before he learned French, and he spoke French with an accent his whole life. He was mocked for it at the French military academy where he trained. The other boys called him the foreigner. He graduated early. He was better at mathematics than almost anyone in his class. He rose through the chaos of the French Revolution, a period when the old order had been destroyed, and no new order had yet solidified, with a clarity of vision and a speed of decision-making that seemed almost inhuman. While other generals deliberated, Napoleon had already moved. While committees argued, he had already won. By 30 years old, he was the most powerful man in France. By 35, he had crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral, taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head himself. The gesture was deliberate. No one gives me power. I take it. What he built in the years that followed reshaped Europe so completely that most Europeans today still live inside systems he either created or accelerated. The Napoleonic Code. His standardization of French law became the legal foundation for the laws of France, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Quebec, and Louisiana. The concept of the modern, centralized state with standardized weights and measures, a national education system, a national bank, and a civil service based on merit rather than aristocratic birth. These are Napoleonic ideas, still running quietly beneath the surface of modern governance. He fought 60 battles and lost 7, and then Russia. The invasion of Russia in 1812 is studied in military academies to this day as a master class in how the greatest minds can be undone by the oldest forces. Winter, distance, supply lines, an enemy willing to burn their own cities rather than surrender them. He entered Russia with nearly 500,000 men. He left with perhaps 100,000. He was exiled twice. He escaped the first exile. He lost at Waterloo and was sent somewhere he couldn't escape, a tiny island in the South Atlantic called St. Helena, where he died 6 years later at 51. Small island, foreign boy with an accent. He ended where he began. But in between, he had remade the world. Adolf Hitler. He was the shortest significant person in the room, or almost nowhere he went. That detail matters, because one of the most persistent stories about Napoleon Bonaparte, that he was a tiny, aggressive little man compensating for his height, is largely a myth. He was around 5'6" or 7" in modern measurements, average for his time. The rumor was partly British propaganda, partly a confusion over French and English units of measurement, and partly the instinct powerful people have always triggered in those who fear them, shrink them down, make them laughable, make their ambition seem like a symptom rather than a force of nature. Because Napoleon's ambition was not a symptom of anything, it was the most disciplined, focused, intellectually rigorous ambition the modern world had ever produced. He was born on Corsica, an island that had been sold to France by Genoa the year before his birth, which meant that, technically, for 1 year, he wasn't even French. He grew up speaking Corsican and Italian before he learned French, and he spoke French with an accent his whole life. He was mocked for it at the French Military Academy, where he trained. The other boys called him the foreigner. He graduated early. He was better at mathematics than almost anyone in his class. He rose through the chaos of the French Revolution, a period when the old order had been destroyed and no new order had yet solidified, with a clarity of vision and a speed of decision-making that seemed almost inhuman. While other generals deliberated, Napoleon had already moved. While committees argued, he had already won. By 30 years old, he was the most powerful man in France. By 35, he had crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral, taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head himself. The gesture was deliberate. No one gives me power. I take it. What he built in the years that followed reshaped Europe so completely that most Europeans today still live inside systems he either created or accelerated. The Napoleonic Code. His standardization of French law became the legal foundation for the laws of France, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Quebec, and Louisiana. The concept of the modern, centralized state, with standardized weights and measures, a national education system, a national bank, and a civil service based on merit rather than aristocratic birth, these are Napoleonic ideas, still running quietly beneath the surface of modern governance. He fought 60 battles and lost 7. And then Russia. The invasion of Russia in 1812 is studied in military academies to this day as a masterclass in how the greatest minds can be undone by the oldest forces. Winter, distance, supply lines, an enemy willing to burn their own cities rather than surrender them. He entered Russia with nearly 500,000 men. He left with perhaps 100,000. He was exiled twice. He escaped the first exile. He lost at Waterloo and was sent somewhere he couldn't escape, a tiny island in the South Atlantic called St. Helena, where he died 6 years later at 51. Small island, foreign boy with an accent. He ended where he began, but in between he had remade the world. Joseph Stalin, he rewrote his own birthday. The real date was December 18th, 1878. But at some point, Stalin changed it in official records to December 21st, 1879, a full year erased. The reason is still debated by historians. Maybe it was to avoid military conscription as a young man. Maybe it was simply because he could. Because by the time it mattered, he was the kind of man who could reach back into the past and change it. And if he could change his own past, he could change everyone else's too. That instinct, the compulsion to control, not just the present, but the official version of reality itself, is the key to understanding Joseph Stalin. Not the violence, though the violence was staggering. Not the paranoia, though the paranoia consumed everyone around him. The key is the rewriting, the insistence that truth was not something discovered, but something decided. He was born in Georgia, the son of a cobbler and a deeply religious mother who wanted him to become a priest. He studied at a seminary. He read Marx in secret. He was expelled. And somewhere in the gap between the boy his mother prayed for and the man he became, something fundamental closed off inside him. He joined the Bolshevik revolutionary movement as a young man and became one of its most effective, least glamorous operators. While Lenin theorized and Trotsky orated, Stalin organized. He robbed banks to fund the revolution. He coordinated logistics. He did the unglamorous, brutal, necessary work that more idealistic revolutionaries considered beneath them. They underestimated him almost universally. When Lenin died in 1924, the assumption was that Trotsky, brilliant, charismatic, intellectually dazzling, would inherit the Soviet Union. Stalin outmaneuvered him so quietly and completely that Trotsky didn't fully realize what had happened until he was already losing. Stalin had spent years placing loyal people in every significant position of the party structure. When the moment came, he simply turned the machine on. Trotsky was eventually exiled, then hunted, then killed with an ice axe in Mexico City in 1940. Stalin's rule over the Soviet Union lasted nearly 30 years. What happened inside those 30 years sits at the outer boundary of what the human mind can process. The forced collectivization of agriculture in the early 1930s triggered a famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor, that killed somewhere between 3 and 7 million people. The Great Purge of the late 1930s saw hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens executed and millions more sent to the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps spread across the frozen edges of the country. He purged his own generals on the eve of World War II, leaving the Soviet military catastrophically unprepared for the Nazi invasion of 1941. And yet the Soviet Union survived, and won. At an almost incomprehensible cost in human life, estimates suggest over 20 million Soviet citizens died in the war the country Stalin had built through terror and industrialization became one of the two superpowers that shaped the entire second half of the 20th century. He died in 1953, possibly having been poisoned by people close to him, possibly from a stroke, possibly both. His inner circle waited several hours before calling a doctor. Nobody wanted to be the one who saved him. Mao Zedong. He grew up watching his father count rice, not metaphorically. His father was a grain merchant in rural Hunan province, a man who had clawed his way from poverty into modest prosperity through discipline and calculation. He counted every grain that came in and every grain that went out. He beat his son for laziness. He believed that hardness was the only honest preparation for a hard world. Mao absorbed the hardness. He rejected everything else. As a young man, he was a voracious, undisciplined reader. He would borrow books and disappear into them for days. He was drawn to stories of powerful men who bent history to their will, Chinese emperors, rebel leaders, figures who had taken a broken world and remade it by sheer force of vision. He was not a modest young man. He did not dream modest dreams. He believed from very early on that he was one of those figures. The China he grew up in was a country being eaten alive. The Qing dynasty had collapsed. Warlords carved up the countryside. Foreign powers, Britain, Japan, France, the United States, had spent a century humiliating China, extracting its resources, occupying its ports, treating its people as though their sovereignty was a minor inconvenience. The wound of that humiliation ran through every layer of Chinese society. Mao decided Marxism was the knife he would use to cut it out. What followed was decades of revolutionary warfare, so brutal and so sustained that it reshaped the most populous nation on earth. The Long March alone, a 6,000-mile strategic retreat through some of China's most unforgiving terrain, became the founding myth of Chinese communism. Of the roughly 86,000 soldiers who began it, fewer than 8,000 finished. Mao walked with them. That detail mattered enormously to the men who survived. In 1949, after decades of civil war and Japanese occupation, Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. He was 55 years old. He had been fighting for this moment for 30 years. And then, having won, he kept going. The Great Leap. Forward, his attempt to transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial superpower in a matter of years triggered one of the deadliest famines in human history. Somewhere between 15 and 55 million people died between 1959 and 1961. The numbers are so large they stop feeling real. Local officials, terrified of reporting failure to Mao, falsified grain production figures while people starved in the fields below them. The Cultural Revolution followed, a decade of deliberate chaos in which Mao unleashed the young against the old, the revolutionary against the intellectual, the pure against the impure. Universities closed, teachers were beaten in the streets, ancient artifacts were destroyed, millions were imprisoned, tortured, killed, or simply unmade. He died in 1976, frail and barely able to speak, still in power. Today, China is the second largest economy in the world, The Communist Party he built still governs 1.4 billion people. His face still hangs over Tiananmen Square, looking out over the city from the same gate where he once declared victory. The man who watched his father count rice ended up deciding, for decades, whether 1 billion people ate at all. Cleopatra. She was not Egyptian. This is the first thing that quietly reframes everything you think you know about her. Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra, the one history remembers, was Macedonian Greek by descent. Her family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years by the time she was born, and in all that time, not one of them had bothered to learn the Egyptian language. Cleopatra learned it. She learned 9 languages in total. That detail is not trivial. It tells you exactly the kind of mind she had, and exactly the kind of ruler she intended to be. Every monarch before her had governed Egypt from a distance, through interpreters, through intermediaries, through the comfortable buffer of cultural superiority. Cleopatra walked directly into a kingdom. She spoke to her priests in their own tongue. She presented herself in temples as the goddess Isis incarnate. She understood, with a sophistication that was centuries ahead of most rulers, that power is not just force. Power is also theater. She needed every weapon available to her because her position was precarious from the beginning. She came to the throne at 18, ruling jointly with her 10-year-old brother, who was also technically her husband. A dynastic arrangement that sounds grotesque to modern ears, but was standard practice for the Ptolemies. Within a few years, her brother's advisors had driven her out of Egypt entirely. She was living in exile on the border, assembling a small army, trying to figure out how to take back her own country. And then Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. What happened next has been romanticized so thoroughly by history and Hollywood that the actual political calculation underneath it tends to get lost. She had herself smuggled into the palace past her brother's guards, wrapped in a carpet or a linen sack, depending on the source, and delivered directly to Caesar. Whatever passed between them that night, Caesar was committed to her cause by morning. Was it seduction? Certainly partly. But Caesar was not a man easily manipulated by beauty alone. What she offered him was a mind that matched his own, a ruler who understood power as clearly as he did, a strategic ally in the wealthiest country in the known world. Egypt's grain fed Rome. Egypt's gold funded empires. The woman who controlled Egypt was not a prize, she was a partner. She had a son with Caesar. After his assassination, she aligned herself with Mark Antony, the man who seemed most likely to dominate Rome next. She had 3 children with him. Together they built something that looked, briefly, like an Eastern empire that might rival Rome itself. Then Octavian Caesar's adopted son, cold and precise and utterly without sentiment, came for them. Antony's forces collapsed. He died believing Cleopatra had already surrendered. She hadn't. But when she realized Octavian intended to take her to Rome as a trophy, to parade her through the streets in chains for the crowds to jeer at, she made a final calculation. She was 39 years old. She chose the manner of her own ending, and in doing so, denied Octavian the one thing he wanted most. The last ruler of an independent Egypt died on her own terms, and 2,000 years later, her name is more alive than almost anyone who outlived her. Socrates. He never wrote a single word, not one sentence, not one page. Everything we know about the man who is arguably the father of Western philosophy comes filtered through other people's accounts, most of them written after his death, most of them written by people who loved him, and therefore had every reason to make him larger than he actually was. And yet even through that filter, something comes through that feels unmistakably real. A short, ugly man, he described himself that way, and his contemporaries agreed, wandering the streets of Athens in the same unwashed cloak, barefoot in all seasons, stopping people in the marketplace, at the gymnasium, at public gatherings, and asking them questions, not lecturing, not proclaiming, asking, "What is justice? You seem very confident, you know. Tell me. Let us examine it together." And then, with a patience and a precision that his contemporaries found either thrilling or infuriating, depending on their temperament, he would take whatever answer they gave and turn it gently, carefully, until it collapsed under its own weight. Politicians who were certain they understood virtue, poets who were certain they understood beauty, generals who were certain they understood courage. He left them all standing in the rubble of their own assumptions. He called this process the beginning of wisdom. He had a name for the state it produced: aporia, productive confusion. The moment when you realize that the thing you are most certain about is the thing you understand least. He believed this was not a destination, but a starting point. That the examined life, a life spent questioning your own assumptions, your own values, your own certainty, was the only life worth living. Athens was not entirely grateful for this service. He was put on trial in 399 BC. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. The real charge, sitting beneath those words, was something closer to, "You have spent decades making powerful people feel foolish, and powerful people have long memories." He was 70 years old. His friends had arranged for his escape. The plan was ready. All he had to do was walk away from the city that had sentenced him to death and live out his remaining years somewhere safer. He refused. The argument he made for staying is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of reasoning in human history. He had spent his entire life arguing that the laws of Athens, imperfect as they were, represented a social contract he had freely benefited from. To break that contract now, simply because it had become inconvenient, would be to betray every argument he had ever made. He drank the hemlock himself, calmly, still talking to his friends about the nature of the soul as the poison moved through his body. He died the way he lived, asking questions that had no clean answers, refusing the comfortable exit. His student Plato wrote it all down. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. The ripple from one barefoot man asking uncomfortable questions in an Athenian marketplace runs directly through the entire intellectual foundation of the Western world. He never wrote a word. He didn't need to. Plato. He was probably not his real name. The man the world knows as Plato was born Aristocles into one of the most prestigious aristocratic families in Athens. The name Plato, which means something close to broad or wide, was apparently a nickname given to him by his wrestling coach, either for his broad shoulders or his wide forehead, depending on the source. He was a gifted athlete before he was a philosopher. He competed in the Isthmian Games. He was built like someone who could have chosen an entirely different life. Then he met Socrates. He was around 20 years old. Socrates was already in his 60s, already infamous, already wandering the city in his unwashed cloak, dismantling people's certainties, one conversation at a time. Something about the encounter changed the trajectory of everything Plato had planned for himself. He burned his early poetry, abandoned his political ambitions, and attached himself to this strange barefoot man as completely as a person can attach themselves to an idea. He followed Socrates for nearly a decade, and then watched him die. The execution of Socrates in 399 BC did something to Plato that never fully healed. He was 28 years old when it happened. He had watched the city he was born into, the democracy he had been raised to believe in, vote to kill the wisest man he had ever known, for asking questions, for making people think. He left Athens immediately afterward. He traveled for years, Egypt, Italy, Sicily. He absorbed mathematics from the Pythagoreans. He studied geometry. He tried, briefly and disastrously, to turn a Sicilian tyrant into his ideal philosopher king, and nearly ended up sold into slavery for his trouble. When he finally came back to Athens, he built something, the Academy, widely considered the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, a place where people gathered not to receive information, but to think together, rigorously, about the deepest questions a human being could ask. It operated for over 900 years after his death. No university in the world today has come close to that lifespan. What he wrote inside and around that institution became the bedrock of Western thought. His theory of forms, the idea that the physical world we experience is merely a shadow of a deeper, more perfect reality, existing beyond our senses, sounds abstract until you realize it became the philosophical skeleton inside Christianity, inside Neoplatonism, inside centuries of mystical and religious thought. The idea that there is a higher truth beyond what we can see and touch did not begin with Plato, but he gave it a rigorous intellectual architecture that made it almost impossible to argue against without using the tools he himself had built. His political philosophy haunts us still. The Republic, his vision of an ideal city governed by philosopher kings, has been used to justify both utopian idealism and totalitarian control, sometimes by people reading the same passages. He wrote dialogues, not treatises, conversations. Socrates almost always at the center, asking questions, pulling ideas apart. It is one of the most elegant intellectual gestures in history, a man who watched his teacher die for asking questions, spending the rest of his life insisting that questions were the only honest form of thought. He never stopped being a student, even after there was no one left to teach him. Aristotle. He was the first person to try to understand everything, not metaphorically, not as an aspiration, as a project, a deliberate, systematic, lifelong attempt to observe, categorize, and explain every phenomenon the human mind could reach. Biology, physics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetics, logic, psychology, meteorology, the nature of the soul, the structure of tragedy, the best way to organize a government, the anatomy of a squid. He wrote about the squid with the same seriousness he brought to the nature of God. That instinct that every single thing in the world is worth understanding on its own terms was so radical and so comprehensive that when his complete works were rediscovered in the medieval Islamic world and then in medieval Europe, the intellectual effect was comparable to a civilization suddenly receiving an instruction manual for reality. Thomas Aquinas, the most important theologian of medieval Christianity, referred to him simply as the philosopher, not a philosopher, the philosopher, as if there had only ever been one worth the title. He was born in Stagira, a small town in northern Greece, the son of a physician to the Macedonian royal court. Medicine ran in his blood before philosophy did. His father's work gave him something most philosophers of his era lacked entirely, an instinct for the empirical, for looking at the actual thing, rather than theorizing about what the thing ought to be. He arrived at Plato's Academy at 17 and stayed for 20 years. He was Plato's most brilliant student, and eventually his most serious critic. Where Plato looked away from the physical world toward his realm of perfect forms, Aristotle looked directly at the world and insisted it was enough. Reality, he argued, was not a shadow of something purer. Reality was the thing itself. The truth was in the details, in the specimen, in the observation. When Plato died, Aristotle did not inherit the academy. The reasons are debated: his foreign birth, his philosophical disagreements, both, neither. But he left. He spent years traveling, studying marine biology on the island of Lesbos, making observations about ocean creatures that were so precise they would not be surpassed for 2,000 years. Then Philip of Macedon asked him to tutor his 13-year-old son. That son was Alexander. What passed between them during those years of instruction is largely lost. But its fingerprints are visible everywhere in Alexander's campaigns. The curiosity, the fascination with foreign cultures, the habit of bringing scientists and botanists along on military expeditions to catalogue what they found. Alexander the Conqueror carried books. That is not an accident. After Alexander's conquests opened the world, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. He taught while walking, which is why his followers were called the Peripatetics, the walkers. He was forced to flee Athens near the end of his life, when anti-Macedonian sentiment turned dangerous after Alexander's death. He left, he said, so Athens would not sin against philosophy twice. He died a year later. But his system of logic, the formal rules for how valid reasoning works, ran every university curriculum in Europe for nearly 2,000 years. His biological observations filled the gaps in human knowledge about the natural world until the Renaissance. His ethics still anchors moral philosophy. He tried to understand everything. He came closer than anyone had any right to expect. Isaac Newton. He was born premature and small enough to fit inside a quart pot. His mother reportedly said he could have fit inside a quart-sized container. The midwives who attended his birth did not expect him to survive the night. His father had already died 3 months before he was born, which meant he arrived into the world fatherless, fragile, and fighting for breath before he had taken his first one. He survived. Barely. And then spent the rest of his life proving something to a world that had already written him off before he could speak. His childhood did not improve much. When he was 3, his mother remarried and left him with his grandmother. Not took him with her. Left him. He never forgave her for it. He kept a list of his sins as a young man, a habit of rigorous self-examination that bordered on self-punishment. And one of the entries reads, "Threatening my father and Mother Smith to burn them and the house over them." He was a child filled with a rage that had nowhere clean to go. It went into work. He arrived at Cambridge University in 1661 as a subsizer, a student who paid his way by performing menial tasks for wealthier students, emptying chamber pots, waiting on tables. He was brilliant, and he was poor, and he knew exactly where he stood in the social order, and he burned with it quietly. Then the plague came. In 1665, bubonic plague swept through England, and Cambridge sent its students home. Newton retreated to his mother's farm in Woolsthorpe. He was 23 years old, with no laboratory, no colleagues, no institutional resources. Just time and a mind that could not stop moving. In 18 months he invented calculus. He developed his theory of universal gravitation. He conducted his experiments on light and color, discovering that white light was not pure, but a mixture of every color in the spectrum. He did this alone, in a farmhouse, during a plague, before he turned 25. He called it his annus mirabilis, his wonder years. He didn't publish most of it for decades. This is the strange texture of Newton's genius. He was not primarily motivated by recognition. He was motivated by something closer to obsession. He needed to understand. He would work a problem for weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating, existing in a state his contemporaries described as almost frightening in its intensity, and then he would lock the solution away in his notebooks and move on to the next problem. When he finally published the Principia Mathematica in 1687, it was arguably the single most important scientific document in human history. The laws of motion, universal gravitation, a mathematical framework that explained the movement of planets, the fall of objects, the behavior of tides. A unified description of physical reality so precise and so comprehensive that it governed physics for over 200 years, until a young patent clerk in Bern sat down with a thought experiment about riding alongside a beam of light and discovered where Newton's framework ended. But here is the part that tends to get left out. Newton spent more time on alchemy and biblical prophecy than he ever spent on physics. He wrote over 1 million words trying to decode hidden messages in Scripture. He believed the universe was a cryptogram set by God for the satisfaction of those brilliant enough to decode it. He was not a scientist who happened to have mystical leanings. He was a mystic who happened to invent modern science while looking for something else entirely. The premature baby who fit in a quart pot, reaching for God, and finding gravity instead. Charles Darwin. He waited 20 years to publish. The idea was essentially complete by 1838. He was 29 years old, freshly returned from 5 years sailing around the world on a ship called the Beagle, notebooks overflowing with observations that had quietly dismantled everything he had been taught to believe about the origin of species. He knew what the evidence was pointing toward. He could see the shape of the theory clearly enough to sketch it out in private notebooks he kept hidden from almost everyone. And then he waited. 20 years. Building the case, accumulating evidence, corresponding with naturalists around the world, studying barnacles for 8 years, 8 entire years, with the obsessive thoroughness of a man who understood that what he was about to say would need to be so airtight, so meticulously documented, so dense with observable fact, that the world would have no clean way to dismiss it. He knew what it would cost. He was a gentle man, deeply domestic. He loved his wife Emma, who was also his cousin, and who was also a devout Christian who understood exactly what her husband's work implied and loved him anyway, with a quiet, complicated devotion that runs through their letters like an unresolved chord. He knew that publishing his theory would devastate her faith. He knew it would overturn the comfortable Victorian certainty that human beings occupied a special, divinely appointed position at the center of creation. He called it his confession, like admitting to a murder. What finally forced his hand was a letter. In 1858, a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, working independently in the jungles of Southeast Asia, sent Darwin a paper describing the same theory, the same mechanism, natural selection, survival of the fittest, arrived at from a completely different direction by a completely different mind, which is perhaps the most powerful possible evidence that a theory is describing something real. Darwin was devastated, then galvanized. Within a year, he had compressed 20 years of accumulated evidence into a book he considered rushed and incomplete. On the Origin of Species sold out on its first day of publication in 1859. What it contained was a complete reimagining of life on Earth, not designed, not fixed, not arranged by a divine hand into permanent, unchanging categories, but fluid, responsive, shaped over incomprehensible stretches of time by the simple, brutal, elegant mechanism of differential survival. The organisms best suited to their environment survive long enough to reproduce. Their traits persist. The others fade. Given enough time, this produces everything. Every creature that has ever lived. Every eye, every wing, every immune system. Every human brain capable of understanding the process that created it. The implications cascaded outward immediately and have never stopped cascading. Psychology, sociology, economics, ethics. Every field that touches on human nature eventually had to reckon with what Darwin had found. The most destabilizing implication was also the simplest. We are not separate from nature. We are not above it. We are not its purpose. We are one of its outcomes, a primate with an unusually large prefrontal cortex, related by common descent to every living thing that has ever existed on this planet. He died in 1882, celebrated, surrounded by his family, at peace. He had done what Newton had done for physics. He had found the hidden mechanism underneath the apparent chaos and given it a name simple enough for anyone to understand. Life changes. The fit survive. Given enough time, this makes everything. He just had the courage to say it out loud. Albert Einstein. He failed to get a job, not at a mediocre institution. Not because he was unqualified. He graduated from the Swiss Federal Polytechnic with perfectly respectable marks, applied for academic positions across Europe, and was turned down everywhere. His professors found him arrogant and difficult. One of them, whose recommendation letter he desperately needed, wrote something so lukewarm it was effectively a dismissal. He applied to be a high school teacher and was rejected. He applied to be a university assistant and was rejected. He ended up working at a patent office in Bern, Switzerland, reviewing other people's ideas for 8 hours a day. A 23-year-old with a physics degree and nowhere to put it. He kept thinking anyway. In 1905, while still working at the patent office, still without an academic position, still largely unknown to the scientific establishment, Einstein published 4 papers in a single year. Any one of them would have been sufficient to establish a major scientific reputation. Together they form one of the most extraordinary intellectual outputs in the history of human thought. He explained the photoelectric effect, which laid the foundation for quantum mechanics. He proved the existence of atoms through his analysis of Brownian motion. He published his special theory of relativity, and he derived, almost as a footnote, the most famous equation in human history, E equals mc squared. Energy and mass are the same thing, expressed differently. The amount of energy locked inside matter is almost incomprehensibly vast. The speed of light multiplied by itself is a number so large that a small amount of mass contains enough energy to level a city. He was 26 years old, working in a patent office, thinking on his lunch break. What special relativity said was genuinely destabilizing in a way that is hard to fully absorb even today. Time is not fixed. It moves differently depending on how fast you are traveling. Space is not a neutral container that things move through. It is a fabric that bends and stretches in the presence of mass. 2 people moving at different speeds will disagree about the timing of the same event, and both will be correct. Simultaneity. The idea that 2 things happen at the same time is not absolute. It depends entirely on where you're standing. The universe, it turned out, was far stranger than anyone had suspected. He spent the next decade extending these ideas into general relativity, which described gravity not as a force, but as a curvature of space-time itself. Massive objects bend the fabric of reality around them. Smaller objects follow those curves. What we experience as the pull of gravity is actually the geometry of space telling matter how to move. This was confirmed in 1919, when astronomers observed starlight bending around the sun during a solar eclipse, exactly as Einstein had predicted. He became, almost overnight, the most famous scientist in the world. His name became a synonym for genius so completely that it has never recovered its specificity. But he spent the last 30 years of his life chasing a unified theory that always stayed just out of reach. A single framework that would reconcile his general relativity with the quantum mechanics his own early work had helped create. He never found it. The man who rewrote the rules of the universe died with the most important equation still unwritten. Some problems, it turns out, are bigger than any single mind, even his. Nikola Tesla. He died alone in a hotel room, room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, January 7th, 1943. A maid knocked and received no answer. When they opened the door, they found him on the bed, 86 years old, frail and paper-thin, dead for what the coroner estimated had been several hours. There was no family present, no close friends, no colleagues gathered at the bedside of the man whose work had made the modern electrical world possible. Just a dead man in a hotel room that he had been unable to pay for in years. The story of Nikola Tesla is many things. It is a story about genius. It is a story about vision so far ahead of its time that the world could not figure out what to do with it. But underneath all of that, it is a story about what happens when brilliance meets the specific, grinding, structural reality of how power and money actually work in the world, and how the world tends to win. He was born in Serbia in 1856, the son of an Orthodox priest, in a lightning storm, which feels almost too perfect to be true, but appears to be accurate. From childhood, he experienced vivid mental imagery, almost hallucination-level visualizations that he eventually learned to use deliberately. He could design and test machines entirely inside his mind, running them mentally through cycles of operation, checking for flaws before he ever built a physical prototype. His colleagues found this unsettling. He found it efficient. He came to America in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison. Edison hired him immediately. Tesla worked for Edison for nearly a year, putting in extraordinary hours, solving problems that had stumped Edison's other engineers. Edison promised him $50,000 if he could redesign his direct current motors and generators. Tesla did it. Edison laughed and told him he didn't understand American humor. There was no $50,000. Tesla quit. What followed was the war of currents. Edison's direct current system against Tesla's alternating current system, backed by George Westinghouse. Direct current could only travel short distances before losing power. Alternating current could travel hundreds of miles efficiently. The physics was not ambiguous. But Edison had invested everything in direct current and fought the transition with everything he had, including public demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted using alternating current to make it seem dangerous. Alternating current won anyway. It was simply better. The electrical grid that powers your home right now runs on the system Tesla designed. He went on to develop the radio. A priority dispute with Marconi was only resolved in Tesla's favor by the Supreme Court months after his death. He developed the Tesla coil, foundational to radio technology. He worked on X-ray imaging, remote control, and early concepts of wireless power transmission. He stood in his laboratory and let hundreds of thousands of volts pass through his body to demonstrate that alternating current was safe. But he was a terrible businessman, and Edison was a genius at business, and Westinghouse, under financial pressure, asked Tesla to tear up the royalty contract that would have made him wealthy beyond imagination. Tesla tore it up, just like that, without apparent hesitation. He died with nothing. His patents and ideas had literally powered a civilization, and he died unable to pay his hotel bill. History is not a meritocracy. It never said it was. Leonardo da Vinci. He left most things unfinished. This is the detail that defines him more honestly than the genius does. The notebooks full of ideas that were never built, the paintings abandoned midway through, the commissions he accepted and failed to deliver, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. The patrons who loved him and raged at him in equal measure because the most talented man they had ever encountered was also, by any conventional measure, profoundly unreliable. He was not a man who finished things. He was a man who could not stop starting them. He was born in 1452 in a small Tuscan town called Vinci, which is where his name comes from, Leonardo of Vinci, the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman who never married. Illegitimacy in Renaissance Italy was not the social catastrophe it might have been elsewhere, but it did close certain doors. He could not follow his father into the notarial profession. He could not attend the university. He received no formal Latin education, which meant he was locked out of the official academic world of his time. He always considered this a wound. He referred to himself in his notebooks, with a bitterness that breaks through the careful handwriting, as an uneducated man. The irony is almost too large to look at directly. He was apprenticed at around 14 to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the finest artists in Florence. Within a few years he had surpassed his master so completely that Verrocchio reportedly put down his brush and never painted again. Florence at that moment was the most intellectually alive city in the world, buzzing with the energy of the Renaissance, full of philosophers and artists and engineers, all bumping against each other and producing something that felt like the future arriving ahead of schedule. Leonardo absorbed all of it, and then kept going. What he produced across his lifetime defies any single category. The Last Supper, the Mona Lisa, anatomical drawings so precise they would not be surpassed for centuries, produced by a man who dissected over 30 human corpses by candlelight in cold hospital basements, because he needed to understand what was underneath the skin before he could paint what was on top of it. Designs for flying machines, solar power concentrators, armored vehicles, hydraulic machines, and a rudimentary robot, all sketched into notebooks in his characteristic mirror script, written right to left, as if he was encoding them against casual readers. He studied the way water moves and spent years filling pages with observations about currents and eddies and the patterns of flow that showed up identically in water and in hair and in the movement of wind through grass. He saw connections between things that existed in completely different domains and followed them with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and the urgency of someone who knew he didn't. He died in France in 1519, reportedly in the arms of the French King Francis I, who had given him a manor house and a stipend and the freedom to simply think. At the end, he reportedly said he had offended God and mankind by not working hard enough. The man who designed flying machines in the 15th century, who painted the most famous image in human history, who understood the human body better than most doctors of his era. Not working hard enough. Some hungers are too large to ever be satisfied, even by a lifetime of everything. Michelangelo. He hated painting, This is the first thing to understand about the man who painted the Sistine Chapel. The ceiling that 4 million people visit every year, that has defined the visual language of Western religious art for 5 centuries, that contains arguably the most reproduced image in human history, 2 hands reaching toward each other across a gap of charged air, was a project Michelangelo resented, delayed, complained about bitterly, and tried repeatedly to escape. He was a sculptor. He believed sculpture was the highest art form. Painting, he felt, was a lesser craft, and the Pope who commissioned the Sistine ceiling, Julius II, was a man so aggressive and imperious that he was known as Il Papa Terribile, the terrifying Pope. He didn't ask Michelangelo to paint his chapel. He commanded it. Michelangelo was 33 years old. He wrote letters home describing the physical agony of the work. His neck locked. His eyes were damaged from paint dripping into them as he worked above his head for years. He developed a spinal curvature. He wrote a sardonic poem about his own suffering that ends with the line, "I am not in a good place, and I am no painter." He spent 4 years on his back on scaffolding, painting something he didn't want to paint, and produced a masterpiece so complete, so technically and spiritually overwhelming, that it redefined what human beings believed art could be. He was born in 1475 in a small village in Tuscany, the second of 5 sons in a family that had seen better days financially and never let anyone forget it. His father considered art a low profession and beat him for pursuing it. He was apprenticed at 13 to the painter Ghirlandaio, one of the finest in Florence, and within a year had surpassed him in the estimation of everyone watching. Lorenzo de' Medici, the most powerful patron in Florence, a man of genuine aesthetic intelligence, noticed him and took him into his household. Michelangelo ate at the Medici table. He sat with humanist philosophers and poets. He absorbed the Neoplatonic ideas that would run through everything he ever made, the belief that the physical form was a vessel for something divine, that the sculptor's task was not to impose a shape on stone, but to liberate the form already imprisoned inside it. He didn't carve his statues. He freed them. The David stands 14 feet tall and was carved from a single block of marble that 2 other sculptors had already rejected and partially damaged. He was 26 years old when he started it. When it was unveiled in the main square of Florence in 1504, the crowd reportedly stood in silence for a long time before anyone spoke. The Pieta Mare, holding the dead Christ, was finished when he was 24. When a visitor attributed it to another sculptor, Michelangelo crept back into the church that night and carved his name into the strap across Mary's chest. It is the only work he ever signed. He lived to 88, longer than almost anyone in his world. He worked until days before his death, still chipping at stone, still unsatisfied, still reaching for something just beyond what his hands could produce. On his deathbed, he reportedly said he regretted that he was dying just as he was beginning to learn something about his craft. 88 years. The Sistine Chapel, the David, the Pieta. Just beginning to learn. William Shakespeare. Almost nothing about him makes sense. The man credited with the greatest body of work in the English language was born in a provincial market town, educated at a grammar school, married at 18 to a woman 7 years his senior after getting her pregnant, and then largely disappeared from the historical record for about a decade before reappearing in London as an actor and playwright of growing reputation. No university education, no grand tour of Europe, no aristocratic patronage in his formative years, no diary, no letters, no manuscripts in his own hand, no contemporary account that treats him as the towering figure history would later decide he was, a handful of legal documents, some signatures, a will that famously leaves his wife his second-best bed, and a portrait or two of disputed authenticity. That is almost everything we have. And yet, 37 plays, 154 sonnets, narrative poems, a body of work so vast and so varied that it contains multitudes in the most literal sense, tragedies that reach into the darkest corners of human psychology with a precision that still makes clinical psychologists uncomfortable, comedies so structurally perfect they have been adapted into every culture on earth and still work, histories that took the raw material of political ambition and moral failure and turned them into something that feels uncomfortably contemporary every time a new production opens. He invented, or at minimum popularized, over 1,700 words still in daily use in the English language. Bedroom, lonely, generous, obscene, bedroom, generous, critic, lonely, majestic, eventful. These are Shakespearean words. The English language you are currently hearing processed through your mind is partially his construction. He understood people with a depth that feels almost supernatural, given how little formal education he had. Hamlet's paralysis in the face of action, Iago's weaponized resentment, Lear's catastrophic need for validation from his children, Macbeth's discovery that ambition achieved feels nothing like ambition imagined. These are not character sketches. They are maps of specific, recurring human experiences so accurate that people have been recognizing themselves in them for 4 centuries. The question of whether he actually wrote the plays is one that refuses to die, partly because the gap between the biography and the work feels so vast. How does a glover's son from Stratford write with apparent authority about the courts of Denmark, the politics of Rome, the psychology of Venetian merchants? The proposed alternatives. Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, the Earl of Oxford, all have problems serious enough that mainstream scholarship dismisses them. The most likely answer is also the most uncomfortable one for people who need genius to come with credentials. He just was. Some people are simply able to see further into other people than anyone can fully explain. He retired to Stratford around 1613, bought the second largest house in town, and died 3 years later at 52. The town records note his passing with the same bureaucratic neutrality they would apply to anyone else. The first folio, the collected edition of his plays, was published 7 years after his death by 2 of his actor friends, who gathered the manuscripts from wherever they could find them. If they hadn't bothered, roughly half his plays would have been lost forever. The greatest writer in the English language nearly didn't survive his own death. Karl Marx. He spent most of his adult life broke, not uncomfortably tight, not making do, genuinely, desperately, humiliatingly poor. There were periods in London where he could not afford to buy his children's shoes, where he pawned his coat to pay for paper to write on, where he borrowed money from friends so relentlessly and for so long that most of them eventually stopped being his friends. His children died in infancy, partly because the family could not afford adequate food or heating. He wrote about the exploitation of the working class while being unable to pay his own rent. The distance between his ideas and his circumstances was not lost on him. It sat inside him like a splinter he could never quite reach. He was born in 1818 in Trier, a city in what is now Germany, into a comfortable middle-class Jewish family that had converted to Christianity for practical reasons. His father was a lawyer. He received an excellent education, studied law, then philosophy, then journalism. He was brilliant, argumentative, incapable of institutional compromise. Every newspaper he edited, every organization he joined eventually expelled him or collapsed around him. He was a man whose ideas were always too sharp for the containers people tried to put them in. He arrived in London in 1849 as a political exile and largely never left. He spent his days in the reading room of the British Museum, surrounded by the economic data of the most advanced industrial economy in the world, building his analysis. He watched the factories. He read the parliamentary reports on child labor and working conditions that most people ignored. He saw the gap between the wealth being generated and the lives of the people generating it. And he made it the central question of his intellectual life. Why does the worker get poorer as the world gets richer? What he built in answer to that question was a complete theory of history, economics, and human society. History was not a sequence of great men making great decisions. It was the story of class struggle, of the people who owned the means of production and the people who had nothing to sell but their labor. Every era had its dominant class and its exploited class. Slavery, feudalism, capitalism. Each system contained the seeds of its own contradiction, which would eventually crack it open and produce the next system. He predicted capitalism would eventually produce a working class so large and so immiserated that it would inevitably rise and overturn the system that was consuming it. He was not entirely wrong about the diagnosis. He was catastrophically wrong about the cure. Every government that attempted to implement his ideas in the 20th century produced systems of control and suffering that he would have theoretically opposed and practically enabled. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. The gap between Marx's theoretical communism and what was built in his name contains some of the darkest chapters in human history, and yet his analysis of capitalism, the tendency toward monopoly, the commodification of everything, the alienation of workers from the products of their labor, the concentration of wealth reads in places like a description of the present moment rather than a critique of the 19th century. He died in 1883, his magnum opus Das Kapital unfinished. His wife already gone, his health destroyed by decades of poverty and overwork. 11 people attended his funeral. Within 50 years, nearly half the world's population was living under governments that claimed his name. Sigmund Freud. He told you that you don't know why you do anything. Not as an insult, as a clinical observation. The central claim of Sigmund Freud's life work was this: the part of your mind you have access to, the part that narrates your decisions and explains your behavior to yourself and others, is not the part running the show. Underneath it, vast and dark and largely inaccessible, is something else entirely. Drives, fears. Memories buried so deep you have no conscious awareness of them. Desires so unacceptable to your sense of yourself that your mind has hidden them from you automatically, without your permission, for your own psychological protection. He called it the unconscious, and he argued it was controlling you right now. He was born in 1856 in Moravia, now part of the Czech Republic, the eldest son of a wool merchant who doted on him completely. His mother called him her golden Siggy. He was brilliant from childhood, in the way that exhausts teachers and delights parents, reading Shakespeare at 8, finishing at the top of his class consistently, arriving at the University of Vienna with the focused ambition of someone who had decided very early that ordinary life was not going to be sufficient. He trained as a neurologist. He was a scientist first, always. He wanted to understand the brain mechanically, physically, the way Newton had understood gravity. He spent years doing careful laboratory work on the nervous systems of eels and crayfish before the pull of the mind's stranger territories became impossible to resist. What drew him there was the patience nobody else could explain. Women, it was almost always women, in the Vienna of his era, presenting with paralysis, blindness, loss of speech, physical symptoms with no detectable physical cause. The medical establishment of the time largely dismissed them as hysterical, a word derived from the Greek for uterus, carrying with it everything you need to know about how seriously those patients were being taken. Freud took them seriously. He developed, through years of clinical work, a theory so comprehensive and so strange that it reads in places like mythology, dressed in medical language. The id, the ego, the superego, the Oedipus complex, repression, projection, sublimation, defense mechanisms, the interpretation of dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, the idea that the experiences of early childhood, particularly the relationship with parents, leave structural marks on the psyche that shape every significant relationship and decision for the rest of a person's life. Much of the specific architecture has not survived scientific scrutiny. The Oedipus complex, as a universal phenomenon, is not supported by the evidence. His case studies, re-examined by later researchers, show serious methodological problems. His treatment outcomes were, to put it gently, mixed. And yet, the idea that human behavior is driven by forces we are not consciously aware of is now so deeply embedded in the way educated people think about themselves that it is almost impossible to imagine the world before he said it. The therapeutic conversation, the idea that talking about your inner life to a trained listener can produce psychological change, is a direct descendant of his consulting room. Every therapist practicing today, even those who reject every specific Freudian concept, is working inside an institution he built. He fled Vienna in 1938 when the Nazis annexed Austria. He was 82 years old and dying of oral cancer, the result of decades of cigar smoking, 20 a day, for most of his adult life, continuing even after his jaw was partially removed. When someone suggested he stop, he reportedly said, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." He died in London in 1939, 1 year after escaping. The man who argued you cannot trust your own self-knowledge spent a lifetime constructing a system for looking underneath it. Whether he found what was actually there, or simply built a very compelling story about it, is a question psychology is still quietly arguing about. Mahatma Gandhi. He was thrown off a train, not metaphorically, physically removed from a first-class railway carriage in South Africa in 1893 and dumped onto a platform in the cold at Pietermaritzburg station because a white passenger objected to sharing the compartment with an Indian man. He had a valid first-class ticket. He refused to move to the third-class carriage. A constable was called. His luggage was thrown onto the platform after him. He sat in the waiting room that night, shivering, trying to decide whether to go home. He stayed. That decision, made by a 23-year-old lawyer in a cold railway waiting room in South Africa, eventually unraveled the largest empire the world had ever seen. He was born Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi in 1869 in a small coastal town in Gujarat, India. His father was a local political administrator, his mother deeply religious, her faith so woven into the texture of daily life that it became the first language of his moral imagination. He was shy as a child, terrified of the dark, not obviously destined for greatness by any conventional measure. He went to London to study law at 18. He went to South Africa at 23 for what was supposed to be a 1-year legal assignment. He stayed for 21 years. South Africa made him. The systematic, daily, institutionalized humiliation of Indian people there, the pass laws, the restrictions, The casual contempt embedded in every layer of colonial administration gave his abstract moral instincts a concrete target. He began organizing. He began writing. He began developing, through years of experiment and failure and refinement, the philosophy and the method that would become his life's work. He called it satyagraha, truth force, soul force. The idea was radical in its simplicity. You do not fight injustice with violence, because violence makes you the same as the system you are fighting, and because the moral authority you sacrifice by picking up a weapon is more valuable than any tactical advantage it gives you. Instead, you resist, openly, non-violently. You accept the consequences of your resistance, the beatings, the imprisonment, the suffering, and you do it publicly, so that the system is forced to reveal what it actually is. You make the violence visible. You make the oppressor perform their oppression in front of the world, and then you trust that enough people watching will be unable to bear what they see. It worked. Imperfectly, partially, with enormous cost. But it worked. He returned to India in 1915 and spent the next 3 decades transforming the independence movement from an elite political project into a mass uprising. The Salt March of 1930, a 240-mile walk to the sea to make salt in defiance of British taxation law, is still studied as a masterclass in political theatre. He chose salt deliberately. Everyone needed it. Everyone was affected by the tax. The British could not suppress a man peacefully walking to the ocean without looking exactly like what he was accusing them of being. India gained independence in 1947, but the partition that accompanied it, the violent division of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan that killed somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million people, broke something in him that never healed. He fasted, he pleaded, he walked into riot-torn cities alone, his presence sometimes enough to stop the killing, sometimes not. He was assassinated in January 1948, 5 months after the independence he had spent his life pursuing, shot 3 times at point-blank range by a Hindu nationalist who believed he had been too accommodating to Muslims. He died with the name of God on his lips. The shy boy who was afraid of the dark walked into the heart of the British Empire with nothing but the weight of moral clarity, and made it blink. Nelson Mandela. He walked out of prison and did not look back in anger. This is the detail that stops people, not the 27 years, not the hard labor in the lime quarry on Robben Island that damaged his eyesight permanently from the glare of the white stone. Not the tiny cell, 6 feet by 6 feet, where he slept on a mat on the floor and was allowed 1 visitor every 6 months for 30 minutes, no physical contact permitted. All of that is staggering enough. But the part that defies easy explanation is what he chose to do with it. He was born in 1918 in a small village in the Eastern Cape, the son of a Thembu chief, given the name Rolilala, which means roughly pulling the branch of a tree, or more colloquially, troublemaker. The name Nelson came from a schoolteacher who, following the colonial custom of giving African children English names, assigned it on his first day of school. He carried both names his whole life, which feels appropriate for a man who spent his life navigating 2 worlds simultaneously. He arrived in Johannesburg as a young man, became a lawyer, and watched the apartheid system, the most comprehensively institutionalized racial segregation in the modern world, construct itself around him in real time. The pass laws, the forced removals, the Bantustans, the systematic dismantling of black South African life into a condition of permanent, legalized servitude. He joined the African National Congress. He organized, He protested. He tried every legal avenue available to him. The government closed them all. He made a decision that he spent years wrestling with, that cost him more than he publicly admitted. He authorized the formation of a military wing. He chose sabotage over non-violence. He studied the writings of revolutionary movements around the world. He understood that what Gandhi had accomplished against the British Empire depended partly on a moral audience, a watching world, capable of being shamed. He was not certain that audience existed for black South Africa in the same way. He was arrested in 1962 and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964. He was 45 years old. The South African government's strategy was straightforward. Isolate him, silence him, let him be forgotten. Let the movement wither without its most visible symbol. They banned his image. They banned his words. For years it was illegal in South Africa to publish a photograph of Nelson Mandela. It didn't work. The silence around him became its own kind of presence. His imprisonment became the most visible symbol of apartheid's brutality in the world. The pressure built for decades, internationally, economically, culturally, until the system could no longer sustain itself. He was released in February 1990. He was 71 years old. The cameras caught him walking out of Victor Verster prison, fist raised, Winnie beside him, blinking in the sunlight of a free afternoon for the first time in nearly 3 decades. He did not call for revenge. He called for negotiation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission he supported after becoming South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994 was built on a principle that most people who had suffered what he suffered would have found impossible. Acknowledge the truth of what happened. Seek reconciliation over retribution. Try to build something new without burning down everything old. History has debated endlessly whether it was enough, whether reconciliation without justice is simply forgetting with better branding. But the country did not collapse into the race war that many had predicted as inevitable, and the man who had every reason to emerge from 27 years of imprisonment as a vessel of pure fury chose instead to become something rarer. A reason to believe that the better version of events was still possible. Martin Luther King Jr. He almost didn't give that speech. The one everyone knows. The one with the dream. August 28, 1963. 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, the largest political demonstration in American history to that point. He had prepared remarks. He had worked on them carefully, the way he worked on everything. He had a PhD in systematic theology from Boston University, and he brought that same rigorous, architectured thinking to every sermon, every speech, every letter he wrote. He was reading from his prepared text, and then Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer standing nearby, called out to him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He pushed his notes aside. What followed in the next few minutes is one of the most extraordinary pieces of improvisational oratory in human history. Not because it was unplanned, the dream imagery had appeared in earlier speeches. He had been developing these ideas for years, but because of what he did with it in that moment. The rhythm, the repetition, the way each phrase built on the last like a wave gathering itself before it breaks. The way he took the specific, grinding, daily humiliation of Black American life in 1963 and connected it to the oldest promises America had made about itself. He was not asking for something new. He was asking America to become what it had always claimed to be. He was born Michael King Jr. in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1929, the son of a Baptist minister who later changed both their names to Martin Luther, after the German Protestant reformer. The church was not just his father's profession. It was the atmosphere he breathed, the language he learned to think in, the institution that had been the center of Black American community life through slavery and Reconstruction, and the grinding decades of Jim Crow that followed. He grew up in a world of water fountains marked white and colored, of seats at the back of buses, of schools that received the cast-off textbooks from white schools after white children were done with them, of a social order maintained not just by law, but by the constant, ambient threat of violence that hung over black life in the American South like weather. He was 15 years old when he entered Morehouse College, ordained at 18. He had his doctorate at 26. He was 26 years old when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, and the community asked him to lead the boycott that followed. He said yes. For the next 13 years he was a target. His home was bombed. He was stabbed in the chest by a mentally ill woman in 1958. The blade came so close to his aorta that his doctors told him later that if he had sneezed before surgery, he would have died. He was surveilled by the FBI, which under J. Edgar Hoover ran a systematic campaign to destroy him, wiretapping his phones, sending him fabricated evidence of affairs, and at one point mailing him a letter that appeared to encourage him to take his own life before his secrets were exposed. He kept going. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, legislative achievements that dismantled the legal architecture of American apartheid, won in part through the pressure his movement generated. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 at 35, the youngest recipient in history at that time. He was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, on April 4, 1968. He was 39 years old. He had been in Memphis supporting striking sanitation workers. The night before he died, he gave a speech in which he said, with an eerie prescience that still raises the hair on the back of the neck, that he had been to the mountain top, that he had seen the promised land, that he might not get there with them. He was 39 years old. The dream he described that afternoon in Washington is still, more than 60 years later, only partially fulfilled. But the distance between where America was and where it is now contains his fingerprints everywhere you look. Abraham Lincoln, he taught himself almost everything he knew. No university, no formal legal training, no wealthy family smoothing the path ahead of him with connections and capital. He was born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, grew up in Indiana and Illinois, and received what he later estimated was about 1 year of formal schooling in total, scattered across his childhood in fragments whenever a teacher happened to be available within walking distance. He walked miles to borrow books. He read by firelight when there was nothing else available. He taught himself law by borrowing a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, and reading it so many times the binding fell apart. He taught himself surveying to earn money. He taught himself the political philosophy that would eventually make him one of the most articulate defenders of democratic government in American history. He was relentlessly, almost desperately self-improving, not because he had been told education was important, but because he could feel, with a clarity that never left him, exactly how much he didn't know and exactly what it was costing him. He was a strange-looking man, and he knew it. 6'4" in a century where the average man stood 5'7". Enormous hands, a face he described himself as common-looking, telling a story about a woman who once accused him of being two-faced, to which he replied that if he had another face, do you think he would be wearing this one? He deflected with humor the way some people deflect with anger. It was a survival mechanism developed in a childhood that had very little softness in it. His mother died when he was 9. His sister died in childbirth when he was 19. His first serious love, Anne Rutledge, died of typhoid fever when he was 26, and the grief that followed was severe enough that his friends feared for his sanity. He suffered from what he called the hypos, what we would now recognize as clinical depression, throughout his adult life. There were periods when people close to him hid razors and knives out of caution. He entered politics anyway, failed repeatedly, lost races for the Illinois legislature, for the Senate twice, for the vice presidential nomination. He kept running. He had a capacity for absorbing defeat without being permanently flattened by it that was almost biological in its consistency. He was elected president in 1860, and by the time he was inaugurated, 7 southern states had already left the Union. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history. The Civil War killed approximately 620,000 soldiers. More Americans died in that war than in both world wars combined. Lincoln bore the weight of those deaths with a visibility that aged him catastrophically. The photographs from the beginning of his presidency and the end show what looks like 2 different men separated by 20 years. The span was 4. He did not enter the war to end slavery. He entered it to preserve the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 was partly a military and political calculation. It kept Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy, whose economies depended on not appearing to ally with slaveholders. But something shifted in him as the war ground on. The language of his speeches deepened. The second inaugural address, delivered 5 weeks before his death, contains some of the most morally serious writing any American president has produced before or since, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He was shot in the back of the head at Ford's Theatre on April 14, 1865, 5 days after the Confederate surrender. The war was effectively over. He died the following morning without regaining consciousness. He was 56 years old. The self-taught boy from the log cabin had held the country together through its worst crisis, at a cost he paid in ways that are still being tallied. And then he didn't get to see what came after. George Washington. He could have been king, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. After the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, there were serious, influential voices in the new American Republic arguing that what the country needed was a monarch. The chaos of the Continental Congress, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, the fragility of a nation trying to govern itself through committee, all of it made the case, to practical men with practical minds, that a strong, centralized authority with a single leader was the only thing that would hold the experiment together. They had someone specific in mind. George Washington was the most admired man in America, by a margin so large it barely constituted a competition. He had commanded the Continental Army through 8 years of war against the most powerful military force in the world. He had kept that army together through Valley Forge, through mutinies, through chronic shortages of food and weapons and money, through moments when the entire enterprise seemed on the verge of simply dissolving into exhaustion and despair. He had done it through a combination of personal authority, physical presence, and a moral consistency that his contemporaries found almost superhuman. When the war ended, he resigned his commission and went home to Mount Vernon. That gesture, a victorious general voluntarily surrendering power to civilian authority, was so historically unusual that King George III of Britain, upon hearing of it, allegedly said that if Washington did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. He did that. He was born in 1732 in Virginia, into the landed gentry of colonial America. Not the wealthiest family in Virginia, but comfortable. He received a modest formal education, became a surveyor as a young man, inherited Mount Vernon at 20, and launched himself into the military and political life of the colony, with an ambition that was large and careful, and almost never undisciplined. He was not a brilliant military strategist in the way Napoleon was brilliant. He lost more battles than he won. What he understood, with a clarity that proved more valuable than tactical genius, was the strategic reality of his situation. He did not need to defeat the British army outright. He needed to keep his own army in existence long enough for the political and economic costs of the war to make Britain decide it wasn't worth continuing. He needed to survive. And so he retreated, and retreated, and retreated, and kept retreating until the moment came when retreating was no longer necessary. He became the first President of the United States in 1789, largely because no one could imagine anyone else doing it, and partly because everyone understood that the precedents set by the first president would define the office forever. He understood this himself with unusual clarity. Every decision he made knowing it would be cited by every president who came after him. He served 2 terms and refused a third. That refusal again, the voluntary surrender of power, set a precedent that held for 150 years, until Franklin Roosevelt broke it under the pressure of the Second World War, and was then codified into law by constitutional amendment. He owned enslaved people, over 300 of them at the time of his death. He expressed private discomfort with slavery throughout his life and did nothing consequential to challenge it. He freed his enslaved workers in his will after his wife's death, a gesture that cost him nothing while he was alive. This is the shadow that falls across the monument, and it does not shrink the longer you look at it. He died in 1799, 2 years after leaving the presidency, from what was likely acute epiglottitis, made worse by the medical treatment of the era, which drained him of roughly 40% of his blood in 12 hours. He had asked to be allowed to die without too much fuss. The country he helped create named its capital after him, put his face on its currency, and built a 550-foot marble obelisk in the center of its most important city, simply to mark the place where he had stood. He could have been king. He chose to be a citizen. And that choice, more than any battle he ever fought, is why the Republic survived. Queen Elizabeth I. She was declared illegitimate before she was 3 years old. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was arrested on charges of adultery and treason when Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. Whether those charges were true has been debated by historians for 5 centuries. What is not debated is what happened next. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green. Henry VIII had the marriage annulled, which meant his daughter Elizabeth was now, legally, nobody. Not a princess. Not an heir. A bastard child whose mother had been executed by her own father. She was 2 years old. What that does to a child's understanding of power, of safety, of how suddenly the ground can disappear beneath your feet, is something Elizabeth never directly articulated. She was not a woman who revealed her interior life easily or often, but you can feel it in every significant decision she made as queen. The wariness, the absolute refusal to place herself in a position of dependency, the lifelong resistance to marriage that frustrated her advisors and baffled her contemporaries, and which makes complete, devastating sense when you understand what marriage had meant in her family. Her father had 6 wives. 2 were executed. 1 died in childbirth. 1 was divorced. The institution of marriage, viewed from Elizabeth's position, looked less like a partnership than a mechanism for disposal. She survived her father. She survived the reign of her Protestant half-brother, Edward, who died young. She survived the reign of her Catholic half-sister Mary, who imprisoned her in the Tower of London for 2 months on suspicion of involvement in a Protestant rebellion. She walked out of that tower and kept walking, carefully, for 5 more years, until Mary died and the crown fell to her. She was 25 years old. What she inherited was a kingdom fractured by decades of religious upheaval, financially depleted, militarily weak, and surrounded by Catholic European powers who considered her illegitimate and her Protestant faith a heresy punishable by deposition or death. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in the world, had been married to her dead sister and considered England his to reclaim. She reigned for 44 years. What she built in those 44 years was the foundation of an idea that would eventually become the most powerful empire in human history, not through military conquest alone, though she authorized enough of that, but through a more subtle, more durable form of power. She made England believe in itself. She was a master of political theater in the way Cleopatra had been, in the way Caesar had been. She understood that a monarch was also a symbol, and she managed that symbol with extraordinary discipline. The speeches, the portraits, the carefully constructed image of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, married not to any man, but to her kingdom. She took the thing her advisers considered her greatest weakness, her unmarried state, her lack of a male heir, and transformed it into a mythological identity so powerful that 4 centuries later, people are still writing books and making films about it. The Spanish Armada of 1588, Philip II's attempt to invade England with a fleet of 130 ships, was defeated by a combination of English naval tactics, Francis Drake's disruption in the harbour at Cadiz, and a catastrophic storm that wrecked the returning fleet. England celebrated it as divine intervention. Elizabeth rode out to address her troops at Tilbury as the Armada approached, wearing armour over her dress, and delivered a speech that is still quoted today. She knew she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but she had the heart and stomach of a king. She died in 1603 at 69, having refused to name a successor for decades because naming an heir meant contemplating her own death, and she refused to give anyone that psychological advantage. She died on the floor, having refused to go to bed, as if staying upright was the last act of will available to her. The girl declared nobody at 2 years old died as one of the most powerful monarchs England had ever produced. She had spent her entire life proving a point. Confucius. He spent most of his life feeling like a failure. This is not the version of Confucius that gets transmitted across 25 centuries of reverence. The statues do not capture it. The temples do not suggest it. But the historical record, filtered carefully through the layers of hagiography that accumulated around him after his death, shows a man who wanted desperately to be useful to the world in a specific, concrete way, and who spent decade after decade watching that usefulness be denied to him. He wanted to govern, not for power, for the same reason a doctor wants to practice medicine. He had developed, through years of study and reflection, a complete vision of how human society should be organized, how rulers should conduct themselves, how relationships between people should be structured, and he believed, with the quiet certainty of someone who has thought deeply about something for a very long time, that if he could find a ruler willing to implement his ideas, the results would be transformative. He never found that ruler. He was born in 551 BC in the state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province, in China. His father died when he was 3. He grew up in modest poverty, educated himself voraciously, and developed an almost devotional relationship with the classical texts and rituals of early Chinese civilization. He believed that the golden age of the early Zhou dynasty, several centuries before his birth, represented something real and recoverable, a time when rulers were virtuous, relationships were properly ordered, and society functioned with a harmony that his own fractured era had lost entirely. He wanted to recover it. He believed he knew how. He spent years wandering from state to state across a China torn apart by the constant warfare of what historians call the spring and autumn period, carrying his ideas, presenting himself at court after court, offering his services as an advisor, being listened to politely, occasionally given minor positions, and then consistently sidelined or dismissed when his advice proved too demanding, too principled, too resistant to the convenient compromises that actual governance always seems to require. The rulers of his era wanted advisors who would tell them how to win. Confucius kept telling them how to be good. These are not always the same project. What he taught was deceptively simple on the surface. Relationships are the foundation of everything. Every significant human relationship, ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, friend and friend, carries with it specific obligations and responsibilities that flow in both directions. Fulfill those obligations with genuine care and sincerity, and society orders itself naturally. Neglect them, and everything fractures. He called the quality at the center of it all Ren, benevolence, human-heartedness, the capacity to treat others with the same consideration you would want for yourself. He gathered students, dozens of them, eventually hundreds. He taught them not through systematic lectures, but through conversation, through questions, through the kind of careful attention to individual character that recognized each student as a different problem requiring a different solution. They recorded his sayings after his death. That collection became the Analects. He died in 479 BC, at 71, believing himself to have failed. Within 2 centuries, the Han dynasty would adopt his philosophy as the official ideology of the Chinese state. For over 2,000 years, mastery of his texts was the entrance requirement for the Chinese civil service. Every government official who administered the largest continuous civilization in human history was selected based on their understanding of what one man taught while wandering, unwanted, between the courts of rulers who couldn't quite see what he was offering them. He shaped more human lives than almost anyone who ever lived, and died thinking he had accomplished nothing. Constantine the Great, he saw something in the sky before the battle. Exactly what he saw depends on which account you read. Some say it was a cross of light above the sun. Some say it was the Greek letters Chi and Rho, the first 2 letters of the word Christ, blazing against the clouds. Some say he dreamed it the night before rather than saw it in daylight. The details shift between sources, between tellings, between the agendas of the people doing the telling. What does not shift is what he did next. He ordered his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol on their shields. And then he marched them into the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD against his rival Maxentius, who commanded a larger force and held the city of Rome behind him. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber when his army broke and the bridge collapsed beneath the retreating soldiers. Constantine entered Rome as its undisputed master. He credited the Christian God. That moment, a Roman emperor publicly attributing his military victory to the god of a minority religion that his predecessors had been actively persecuting for decades is one of the genuine hinges of Western history. One of those moments where you can feel the entire weight of what came before pressing against what came after, and understand that the world that emerged from that pressure was going to be fundamentally different from the world that entered it. He was born around 272 AD in a city in what is now Serbia. His father was a Roman military officer who rose through the ranks to become co-emperor. His mother, Helena, was a woman of obscure origin, possibly an innkeeper's daughter, possibly a concubine who converted to Christianity late in life and became one of its most energetic early patrons, reportedly traveling to Jerusalem in her 80s and returning with what she claimed were fragments of the true cross. Constantine himself grew up in the court of the Emperor Diocletian, essentially as a political hostage ensuring his father's loyalty. He watched power operate from its center. He understood its mechanics with the cold clarity of someone who had grown up inside the machine. When his father died in 306 AD, his troops declared Constantine emperor on the spot. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war as the Roman Empire tore itself apart between multiple claimants to supreme power. Constantine outmaneuvered and outlasted them all, becoming the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire by 324 AD. What he built with that power reshaped civilization. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD formally legalized Christianity throughout the empire. Not just tolerated, legalized. Property confiscated from Christians during persecutions was returned. Churches could be built openly. The religion that had survived 3 centuries of intermittent persecution by going underground was suddenly operating in full daylight with imperial backing. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, gathering bishops from across the Christian world to resolve theological disputes that were fracturing the religion from within. The Nicene Creed. The statement of Christian belief that is still recited in churches every Sunday across the world came out of that council, a Roman emperor presiding over the definition of Christian orthodoxy, the political and the theological so thoroughly intertwined that they have never fully separated since. He built a new capital for the empire in the east on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium and named it after himself, Constantinople, the city that would survive the fall of Rome by nearly 1,000 years, preserving classical knowledge through the dark ages of the West, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. He was baptized on his deathbed in 337 AD, having spent his entire reign as a Christian emperor, technically still unbaptized, a calculation so perfectly political that it tells you everything you need to know about the man behind the conversion. Whether he genuinely believed what he said he saw in the sky before Milvian Bridge, or whether he was a political genius who recognized that a fractured empire needed a unifying faith and Christianity was the most coherent option available, is a question historians have argued about for 17 centuries. Perhaps both things were true. Perhaps that is how history usually works, a genuine experience and a useful one, arriving at exactly the same moment. Charlemagne. He could not write. This detail sits strangely against everything else about him. The man who built the largest European empire since Rome, who oversaw a renaissance of scholarship and learning, so significant that historians call it the Carolingian Renaissance, who filled his court with the finest minds of the age and made education a central project of his reign. This man practiced writing letters under his pillow at night, according to his biographer Einhard, and never mastered it. He could read, he spoke several languages, he conversed fluently with theologians and scholars, but the physical act of writing, attempted too late in life to become natural, remained beyond him. He kept trying anyway. He was born around 742 AD, the son of Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, in a world that had been fracturing since the fall of Rome 3 centuries earlier. Western Europe was a patchwork of warring kingdoms, raided coastlines, and collapsing infrastructure. The roads the Romans had built were deteriorating. The literacy the Romans had spread was retreating. The unified administrative and legal systems that had held together a civilization were gone, replaced by 1,000 local arrangements of varying brutality and competence. Charlemagne looked at that fractured world and spent his entire adult life trying to put it back together. He became king of the Franks in 768 AD, sharing the throne briefly with his brother Carloman, until Carloman died 2 years later under circumstances that contemporary sources treat with diplomatic vagueness. He then ruled alone for over 4 decades, conducting nearly continuous military campaigns that expanded his kingdom in every direction. Saxons to the north, Lombards in Italy, Avars in the east, Moors in Spain. He fought over 50 military campaigns in his reign. He was rarely in one place for more than a few months at a time. But the campaigns were never simply about conquest. He imposed Christianity on every territory he absorbed, sometimes at sword point, with a thoroughness that blurred the line between conversion and coercion so completely that it is sometimes impossible to see a line at all. The forced conversion of the Saxons involved years of warfare and a massacre at Verdun in 782 AD, where, depending on the source, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 Saxon prisoners were executed in a single day for refusing baptism. He built churches everywhere he went. He established schools attached to every cathedral and monastery in his territory, creating an infrastructure of literacy that had not existed in Western Europe for centuries. He standardized weights and measures. He reformed the currency. He insisted on accurate copies of important texts being made and distributed, which is why we have many of the Latin documents we have today. He was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800 AD, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He later said the coronation surprised him, that he would not have entered the church that day had he known what the Pope intended. Historians treat this claim with considerable skepticism, but the relationship it established between papal authority and imperial power became one of the defining tensions of European history for the next 7 centuries. Every European monarch who came after him measured themselves against his shadow. The Holy Roman Empire, that strange political entity that Voltaire famously said was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, traced its legitimacy directly to his coronation. The borders of the territories he controlled roughly prefigured the borders of modern France, Germany, and Italy. The idea of Europe as a coherent civilizational unit, distinct from the Byzantine East and the Islamic South, is in significant part a Carolingian invention. He died in 814 AD at approximately 70 years old, ancient by the standards of his era, having outlived most of his children and watched his carefully constructed empire already beginning to strain at the seams under the pressure of succession disputes. It fractured completely within a generation of his death. But the institutions he built, the literacy he restored, the idea of a unified Christian European civilization he breathed back into existence, those did not fracture. They became the foundation everything else was built on, the man who practiced his letters under his pillow at night, building a world that ran on the written word. Nicholas Copernicus. He waited until he was dying to publish. The manuscript sat finished, or nearly finished, for years, possibly decades. The exact timeline is debated, but the broad shape of it is clear enough. A Polish church administrator and amateur astronomer had worked out, through years of careful observation and mathematical calculation, that everything humanity believed about its place in the universe was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, structurally, cosmologically wrong. The Earth was not the center. The sun was, and he sat on that knowledge for a very long time. The reasons are understandable. The model of the universe he was dismantling had been in place since Aristotle and Ptolemy, over 1,000 years of accumulated intellectual and theological authority. The Catholic Church, which employed him as a canon, had woven the earth-centered cosmos into the fabric of Christian theology so thoroughly that questioning it felt less like a scientific disagreement and more like an act of spiritual vandalism. He was not a confrontational man. He was a careful, methodical, deeply cautious man who understood exactly what he was holding and exactly how much it would disturb the people he had to live among. He was born in 1473 in Royal Prussia, the son of a copper merchant who died when Copernicus was 10. His maternal uncle, a bishop, raised him and paid for his education, which took him through the finest universities of Europe. He studied mathematics at Krakow, canon law and astronomy at Bologna, medicine at Padua, more law at Ferrara. He was not a specialist in the modern sense. He was a Renaissance man in the most literal meaning of the phrase, a person who believed that understanding the world required understanding all of it. He returned to Poland and spent the rest of his life performing his administrative duties for the church with quiet competence while pursuing astronomy in whatever time remained. He observed the sky from a small tower above a defensive wall near his home. He had no telescope. That instrument would not be invented for another 60 years. Everything he calculated from naked eye observations and mathematics alone. What he produced was a complete alternative model of the solar system. Not just the claim that the Earth moved around the sun, but a working mathematical framework that could predict planetary positions. It had problems. He retained circular orbits, which was wrong, and his model was in some ways no more accurate than the Ptolemaic system it replaced. But the core insight was correct, and the core insight was everything. We are not the center. We are passengers. A small handwritten summary of his ideas circulated privately among scholars for years before he committed to full publication. He dedicated the finished work to Pope Paul III, a careful gesture of preemptive diplomacy from a man who understood the political landscape he was navigating. He received the first printed copy of his book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, on the day he died in 1543. Some accounts say he held it in his hands and died hours later. Whether he was conscious enough to understand what he was holding is uncertain. The Church did not immediately ban his work. It took 70 years and the louder provocations of Galileo before the book was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books in 1616. By then, it didn't matter. The idea was already loose in the world. Kepler had taken it and corrected the orbits. Galileo had taken it and pointed a telescope at the sky and found evidence everywhere he looked. Newton had taken it and explained the mechanism underneath it. Einstein had taken Newton's mechanism and shown where it broke down. Every one of those steps traces back to a cautious Polish church administrator who looked at the sky from a tower above a defensive wall and had the intellectual courage, however quietly and however late, to say what he saw. The Earth moves, and nothing, after that, was ever still again. Galileo Galilei. He pointed a tube of glass at the sky, and the world has never recovered. Not immediately, not all at once, but the night in 1609 when Galileo Galilei first turned his improved telescope towards the heavens and began writing down what he saw set in motion a chain of consequences that reached from his small study in Padua all the way to the foundations of how human beings understand their relationship to truth, to authority, and to the universe they inhabit. He was not the first person to build a telescope. Dutch lens makers had developed the basic instrument the year before. But he was the first person to understand what it could mean. He improved the magnification significantly, from roughly 3 times to 30 times, and then he looked up. What he saw did not fit. The moon was not a perfect, smooth sphere, as Aristotelian cosmology required. It was covered in mountains and craters, rough and scarred and unmistakably geological. Jupiter had moons of its own, 4 of them, small points of light that moved around the planet in ways that could only mean they were orbiting it. Venus showed phases like the moon, which was only possible if it was orbiting the sun. The sun itself had spots, dark imperfections on its surface that moved, which meant the sun was rotating and was not the perfect, unblemished body that classical philosophy demanded. Everything the telescope touched turned out to be wrong in exactly the same direction. The universe was not the perfect, unchanging, earth-centered mechanism that Aristotle had described and the Church had sanctified. It was messy and dynamic, and organized around the sun in exactly the way Copernicus had suggested 60 years earlier. Galileo understood immediately what he had and what it meant. He was not a cautious man. He was brilliant, combative, witty, and constitutionally incapable of suffering fools, which is a dangerous combination of qualities when the fools in question have institutional power over your life and freedom. He published his observations in 1610 in a small book called Sidereus Nuncius. The Starry Messenger, written in accessible language, aimed at a broad audience, designed to make the evidence impossible to ignore. It was a provocation as much as a publication. The response from the traditional academic establishment was almost comically defensive. Some philosophers refused to look through the telescope at all, arguing on philosophical grounds that whatever it showed could not be real because Aristotle had not mentioned it. Others looked and claimed to see nothing. Others argued that even if the moons of Jupiter existed, they were an optical illusion produced by the instrument itself. Galileo demolished these objections one by one, with a cheerfulness that made powerful enemies faster than his discoveries did. He was eventually summoned before the Inquisition in 1633, 23 years after his first telescopic observations. He was 68 years old, in poor health, and facing men who had the legal authority to torture and execute him. He recanted. He formally stated that the earth did not move. He was placed under house arrest for the remaining 9 years of his life. The legend says that as he rose from his knees after recanting, he muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves." Historians generally believe he did not say this. It appears in sources written a century after his death. It is almost certainly a story told about him, rather than something he actually said. But it contains a truth larger than the facts. Because the earth did move, and the evidence he had gathered was still out there, and the scientists who came after him, Kepler, Newton, and eventually Einstein, built the entire modern understanding of the physical universe on the foundation of what a combative Italian astronomer saw through a tube of glass one night in Padua. He spent his last years blind, under house arrest, still dictating scientific work to students who came to sit with him. The inquisitors who forced him to his knees are remembered, if at all, as footnotes to his story. Marie Curie. She was radioactive when she died, not metaphorically. Her body, her notebooks, her furniture, her cookbooks, the personal belongings she touched daily for decades, all of it still radioactive. Her laboratory notebooks are stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Researchers who want to examine them must sign a waiver acknowledging the health risk and wear protective equipment. She has been dead for over 90 years, and her belongings are still dangerous. She knew the radiation was killing her. She refused to accept it. This is the texture of Marie Curie's life. Not the sanitized version where a brilliant woman overcomes obstacles through perseverance and goodness. The real version, where a person of extraordinary will drove herself and her work with an intensity that consumed her health, her relationships, and eventually her life, because the work was more important than any of those things, and she had decided that very early and never undecided it. She was born Maria Sklodowska in Warsaw in 1867, the youngest of 5 children in a family of teachers operating under Russian occupation of Poland. Education was a form of resistance in that world. Knowledge was what could not be confiscated. Her mother died of tuberculosis when she was 10. Her father, a physics and mathematics teacher, filled the apartment with scientific instruments and the quiet conviction that understanding the world was a moral obligation as much as an intellectual one. She was brilliant from childhood in a country that had no legal university willing to admit women. She made a pact with her sister Bronia. Marie would work as a governess, sending money to Paris to fund Bronia's medical degree. When Bronia finished, she would return the support and fund Marie's education. It took years. It required the kind of patience that feels less like virtue and more like controlled fury, the energy of someone who has decided that the obstacle will not win, no matter how long it takes. She arrived in Paris at 24, enrolled at the Sorbonne, lived in a garret so cold that the water in her wash basin froze at night, and finished first in her physics degree and second in her mathematics degree. She met Pierre Curie, a physicist of genuine brilliance who recognized her immediately as his intellectual equal and eventually his superior, and who proposed to her with the offer of a shared life organized entirely around scientific work. She said yes. What they built together in a leaking shed that a visiting scientist described as a cross between a stable and a potato cellar was one of the most important bodies of experimental work in the history of science. Following up on Henri Becquerel's discovery of radioactivity, a word she invented, she discovered that the ability to emit radiation was a property of the atom itself, not a product of molecular interaction. This was a profound insight that cracked open the door to atomic physics. She discovered 2 new elements, polonium, named for her occupied homeland, and radium, which glowed faintly blue in the dark of the shed, and which she described in her notes with an almost aesthetic pleasure that makes the tragedy of what it was doing to her body feel unbearable in retrospect. She won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, shared with Pierre and Becquerel. When Pierre was killed by a horse-drawn cart in 1906, she took over his professorship at the Sorbonne, becoming the first woman to hold a professorial chair at that institution. She won a second Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1911, becoming the first person to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences. The Swedish Academy tried to discourage her from attending the 1911 ceremony because a scandal involving a romantic relationship with a married physicist had broken in the French press. She attended anyway. She died in 1934 of aplastic anemia caused by decades of radiation exposure. She had carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes in her pockets. She had stored them in her desk drawers. She had worked with them daily for decades in conditions that would be considered criminally negligent by modern standards, because the concept of radiation safety did not yet exist, and she was too busy discovering the science that would eventually create it. the woman who cracked open the atom, killed, slowly, by the crack. Florence Nightingale. She counted everything. This is the detail that gets lost in the romantic version of her story. The lamp, the angel of mercy moving through darkened hospital wards at night, tending to wounded soldiers with a candle in her hand. That image is real in the sense that it happened, but it captures almost nothing important about what Florence Nightingale actually was and what she actually did. She was a statistician, a data analyst of extraordinary sophistication operating in an era before the profession existed. She understood, with a clarity that most of her contemporaries did not share, that the feelings and impressions and intuitions of well-meaning people were worth almost nothing compared to rigorous, systematically collected evidence. She believed that if you could measure suffering precisely enough, you could convince the people with power to reduce it. She spent her life testing that belief. She was born in 1820 into a wealthy English family that had done her the service of naming her after the Italian city where she was born, Florence, a beautiful name for a woman who would spend her most important years in conditions of spectacular ugliness. Her family was educated, socially connected, and entirely conventional in its expectations for what their daughter's life should look like. A good marriage, a comfortable household. The domestic sphere that Victorian England had decided was the natural boundary of female existence. She refused it. Not dramatically. Not with a manifesto or a rebellion. With a quiet, persistent, infuriating steadiness that wore down every obstacle eventually because she simply never stopped. She believed from a young age, with a religious conviction she took entirely seriously, that God had called her to some form of service. She studied nursing in secret. She visited hospitals and workhouses and took notes. She read reports and blue books and government documents about public health with the focused appetite of someone preparing for an examination. Her family was appalled. Nursing in the 1840s was not a respectable profession. It was associated with drunkenness, promiscuity, and the lowest social classes. It was what women did when they had no other options. She went anyway. When the Crimean War broke out in 1854, reports began reaching England that the British military hospital at Scutari, near Constantinople, was a catastrophe. Soldiers were dying not from their wounds, but from cholera, typhus, and dysentery in conditions of almost unimaginable squalor. The Secretary of War, who happened to be a family friend, asked Nightingale to lead a team of nurses to the hospital. She arrived to find wards so overcrowded that men lay on bare floors in their own waste, with no functioning sewage system, inadequate ventilation, and a medical establishment so resistant to her presence that some military doctors initially refused to let her nurses treat patients at all. She did not argue. She organized. She used her own money and her family's connections to procure supplies. She established kitchens. She created a laundry. She enforced hygiene protocols. She gathered data obsessively, recording every death and its cause in systematic detail that had simply never been done before in a military hospital context. And then she did something that changed the history of how human beings communicate statistical information. She invented a new kind of chart, a circular diagram she called a polar area chart, sometimes called the Rose diagram, that displayed causes of death visually in a way that made the patterns immediately apparent to people who would never have engaged with columns of numbers. She showed, in a form that a politician or a general could grasp in seconds, that the overwhelming majority of deaths in the Crimean hospitals were preventable. Soldiers were not dying from enemy action. They were dying from the conditions of the hospital itself. She sent these charts to members of Parliament. She sent them to the Queen. The mortality rate at Scutari dropped from 42% to 2% during her time there. She returned to England in 1856, famous in a way she found largely irritating, because it focused on the lamp and the nighttime rounds rather than the data and the policy reform. She spent the next decades working almost entirely from her bedroom, having developed a chronic illness that left her largely bedridden, writing reports, corresponding with governments, designing the statistical frameworks for military and civilian health reform that were implemented across the British Empire and then copied by other nations. She reformed the entire administrative structure of military medicine. She designed the first purpose-built secular nursing school. She wrote a book on nursing that defined the profession for a generation. She lived to 90. She worked almost to the end. The woman with the lamp, who understood that the light that actually saves lives is the kind that illuminates a spreadsheet.